Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Gotta Pop podcast. Today, I am joined by a very talented writer and musician and all around cool guy named Gentry Bronson. Welcome to the show, Gentry.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it, man.
And speaking of cool things, I got to talk about your name. Your name is awesome. I told my not I didn't tell your wife. I told my wife that I was having you on the show, and she goes, "Gentry Bronson. That sounds like it should be a character in like some adventure novel or adventure movie." And I
I
said,
am a character in my own adventure movie, and now you are in it with me. So
"Oh,
get
all
ready.
right, fantastic."
We're going to be going, crystal skulls, and there's going to be booby traps. It's going to be crazy, man. Bring
Wow,
your
it sounds like
wit,
a good time will be guaranteed for all. I
yeah,
think.
bomber jacket. Get ready. I hope you're not afraid of snakes.
I'm a little afraid of snakes, but I'll leave those mostly to you. So we are going to talk today, folks. Well, if you're watching this or listening, you probably see that we're going to be talking about the Doors here. But I did want to first introduce you to a little bit further to Gentry. I mentioned in the intro that you are, well, gosh, you got a lot going on. You've been a musician for, I guess, most of your life, I would think. I know you have multiple albums that are available for listeners to check out. I've listened to a couple of them myself, and they're very good.
Oh
And
wow.
well,
Well, now I'll have to
why
find out
don't
which
I
one.
let you take? I'm sorry. Would you say?
Now I'll have to find out which ones you listen to, so I can defend myself.
But yeah. So why don't you fill the audience in a little bit about how long you've been playing music?
Sure. Well, you know what? I'll start with me rudely interrupting you about my name. My name is real. It's not a stage name. I was really named Gentry Bronson, and my parents named me after a hitchhiker.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Seriously?
yeah. They picked up a hitchhiker in a blizzard somewhere between Wyoming and Nebraska before I was born, and his name was Kip Gentry. I got his last name.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
So there you go. Uh,
I mean, Kip wouldn't have been so bad either, but I think
Yeah,
Gentry's a
I
little
mean,
cooler.
Kip is a little weird. I mean, and I'll dovetail this into music. So, uh, I used to tour Europe, but at least once a year from about 2006 to 2014, and and I did a lot of stuff out of the Netherlands,
Oh, wow.
because I had like a minor hit, I guess.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you consider it a hit. It was somebody else's hit, Boudewijn de Groot's hit called Avant, and I was the first American and English speaking artist to do the song in English. So
Well,
I ended
that's
up
very cool.
touring on the strength of that for a lot of time, and then I ended up playing in Belgium and Germany and the Czech Republic, and I used to live in the Czech Republic when I was a DJ.
Oh,
I,
so
I
you've been
used to
all
be
over the place.
yeah, I was a club DJ in the 90s. Trip hop, acid jazz, dub, um,
Wow.
that era. Yeah. So, um, but I bring up the Kip part because when I was, touring in the Netherlands and Belgium, they speak Dutch, and Kip means chicken.
Really?
Yeah. So I would tell this story about my name, and then I would dovetail it into that I don't, the, why I don't eat chicken because I don't eat chicken.
Oh, okay.
So if I had been named Kip, I'd literally be named Chicken Bronson, and that wouldn't work out for me because I don't eat birds.
Yeah,
So
see, it's good it worked out the way it did.
it's yeah, it worked out all right.
In your
Yeah.
honor,
So
I'm working on a novel. Maybe I'll throw in a character in there that could be Kip Bronson, just as a
sure, man.
little tribute
Yeah,
to
for
you.
sure. I don't think there is one that it is in existence. So you have,
Well, there you
you know,
go.
full carte blanche. You don't need my permission.
Well, awesome. I am excited about this.
Okay, so music, yeah. So I kind
Music.
of like I started toward the end. I've been playing music since I was like 4 or 5 years old. I started
Wow.
piano around that time, 4 or 5, and classically, well, not originally classically trained. I originally was learning, Farah Jaka and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star.
Both
Um,
classics. Yeah.
both classics, but maybe not classical. Um, and yeah, so I came up and became started winning awards and stuff as a classical pianist. And then when I was about 14, I discovered the wonderful world of punk rock.
Oh, nice.
And at the time, what would have been called new wave music, so like, I mean, all the classic stuff from the mid to late 80s,
A lot of the cars and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm talking more like New Order and
Oh, okay.
Joy Division and I guess U2 you could throw in there and REM and we had talked a little bit before like the Replacements and Husker
Hmm.
Du and Soul Asylum bands from where I grew up in Minnesota. Um, so I shortly after that I joined my first band and I started singing in bands. I did not blend the piano and the keys and the voice until later.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but so I eventually I had a whole like any creative or artist or musician. I went through all kinds of different worlds. Um
All different
I did my
genres of things you listen to and such.
listened and played. I did my high school garage band punk rock stuff, and then I was part of the Seattle music scene in the early 90s. And I was there in
Wow, that's
91,
quite a time to
92.
have been there.
Yeah, it was a good time to be there. I was in bands and worked the clubs and I was a spoken word poet, and then I moved to San Francisco, and then I was in like avant-garde jazz bands and did more spoken word stuff. And then I moved to Europe and in Prague, that's where I became a DJ. Uh,
Wow.
and then when I got back to San Francisco, that's when I actually started writing songs with piano and vocals and had my music career.
Wow, that's such a great history you have there. And uh, I want to just segue a little bit to the Doors. You had written a story recently. I mean, I know you do a lot online, and later on, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the different things that. I'm just going to not do the later thing. Let's just talk right now. I know that because
Sure,
I
man.
have ADHD. We'll get off on some other topic, and I'll totally forget what I'm bringing up now. But I just wanted to mention too that in addition to you being a musician, I know you've worked for several years now as a sort of a consultant and mentor to artists of different kinds. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I've had a creative and media agency for the last 9 years.
Wow.
So what I did is when I mean, burned out on my musical life, I decided to kind of reinvent myself as somebody that could help other people
Oh,
do what I
that's
had done,
fantastic.
because I was in the indie world,
Hmm.
never signed to Columbia.
Right,
You know,
right.
I never had, whatever a Gentry Bronson version of Swifties would be, I never like um or so so yeah so I formed that agency and uh with the idea that I would help not only musicians but just kind of all creatives, so writers, artists, filmmakers, any creative. And then that to me includes basically everybody because everybody's creative.
Yeah.
So I'm helping a lot of entrepreneurs and people like that kind of start, get their business off the ground. And
That's
so I
wonderful.
types of different people over the last 9 years. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's fascinating and fantastic. I know my wife is actually in school right now. She's going for her MFA, and she's working on a novel as well. And one of her hopes too is to get into. She'd like to teach some, but also maybe have her own consulting. Actually, very similar to what you're saying. She's helped other writers, especially ones that are newer to it, and it's been so satisfying for her to do that. And I've done that some with my editing online. When you're helping someone who is maybe not sure yet of what they want, or maybe even what their greatest talents are, and you can help. I know this is probably going to sound kind of new agey or whatever, but I don't care. But if you can kind of like nurture that and help them grow, I mean, that's a pretty fantastic feeling.
Oh yeah, I'm all about that quote unquote new agey side, because I think that like for people. So I work with a lot of writers and I'm an editor, and I a lot of my client base just the last few years have been mostly writers, actually, probably because I'm a writer and they find
Right.
me through that, or they know me as a musician and then they find out that I'm writing. And so I what I noted is that as people get older, sometimes they need a little assistance with the whole personal transition,
Mm-hmm.
transformation, whatever you're talking about. Like they might be getting to, their 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, and they're kind of like, oh, now I'm retiring, or I'm moving from one thing to another, or I got fired, or COVID was a big,
Mm-hmm.
time. People were like, oh, you know what? I don't want to work for whomever anymore. I want to write a book, right?
Right.
Be a creative. And for people that have never really been in the creative world, like they need a little assistance. So I help them with that. And then my whole foundation of stuff is I work with people as an artist. I'm an artist. I've been an artist all my life. I've had one salary job in my life that lasted like 10 months. So all of my life I've been a contractor, freelancer, uh, in whatever form I was doing. If I was leading a band, or if I was building websites, or if I was doing whatever I was doing, copywriting or whatever, like, so I approach it that way when I work with people. I'm like, I know what it's like to be a struggling artist, and that's why I don't believe in the concept of the struggling artist.
Well, I think that's all fantastic, and it's interesting because I think whether it's someone who has aspirations for music or some sort of creative writing or actually, painting. I mean, there are so many similarities in like the passion that's within us, but not only that, but also the fears I think that are within artists. So
Sure, for
I,
sure.
I love I love what you're doing to help people. I think that's fantastic.
Thanks, man.
Oh, you're
Yeah, it's,
welcome.
I mean, I, I know we'll dovetail into the doors here, but like musicians, there's never a time when, like when I opened for Ray Manzarek, which is I know how we ended up doing
Right.
our podcast today, video cast. Um, like Ray was still playing until the very end, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was still working with new artists, not as a producer, like on stage. When I played with him, it was the Manzarek Rogers band,
Oh,
and
okay.
and I didn't play with him, I opened for him, but he had a four piece like me, and he was the keyboardist and singer like me. I don't like the term keyboardist. I find it really flaccid. But but his guitar player was Roy Rogers, which I know people know of Roy Rogers as the famous
Yeah,
singing cowboy. It
that's
wasn't
right.
that
Right.
Roy Rogers, of
Made
course.
a darn good roast beef
He was
sandwich
a
too.
yeah. Oh, that I didn't know, man. Uh, well, Roy Rogers is actually a really famous slide blues guitarist.
Oh, okay.
So in that world, in the blues world, he's really well known. And so they had the Manzarek Rogers band, and they were writing new stuff. And all the album that they were touring on at that time, the Translucent Blues album, was the lyrics were inspired. They were like Michael McClure and different people that were like pretty well known poets and rock and roll lyricists, and they kind of used that as the foundation of their record. Um, and I bring that up because to me, you're never not trying to push the envelope somewhere as an
Right.
artist. And a creative, and I do believe that all people are creative and are
I
creative,
believe that
but
too.
like if you are a creative, to use that term that some of us now use for people that create stuff, you don't retire.
No.
You're never going to retire. I mean, retiring, how would I do that?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
impossible. So like that was one of the things about that was interesting for me and I still hear this from people when like they say, "Oh yeah, you're retired from music," and I'm like, "No, no, no, I'm not."
No.
If somebody
You're
came along right now and said, "Hey, I got here's a gig, and you know, it's at such and such a place and the money was right and promotion and all that stuff, I'd be like, yeah, man, I'll
Yeah,
do it.
exactly. Like you said, creative people really they don't retire. I mean, yes, you might be doing things, differently than you may have been, years earlier, but there's still that stuff inside of you, and that's there, and you want to use it and tap into it. And I like what you said about Ray, and I've seen that with so many artists as they get older, is that they keep doing this stuff, and it's not just for money. One of the things I didn't read them myself, but I saw, I guess, probably in the last 10 or so years of Ray's life, I know he wrote one or two novels too. I think he might have independently published them, but he didn't have to do that then, but he was an artist, and he kept creating. And I just love that. You see that with older musicians now, Mick Jagger and those guys out on the road. Dion, who recorded back in the 50s and 60s, he just put out a new album. I mean,
you just brought up Jagger. I just got to bring it up. I'm going to see the Stones at Jazz Fest.
No way.
Here in New Orleans in 2 weeks.
Oh, nice. Have you seen them ever?
I've seen them, but they've never played Jazz Fest ever.
Oh, that's incredible.
This is a really historic thing.
That is
They've
really
canceled
awesome.
twice before.
Well, fingers crossed that they're not going to cancel this time.
So like 2 weeks from tomorrow, I'll be seeing the Stones at Jazz Fest, like a couple miles from I am right now.
So
Here in
cool.
New Orleans. Yeah.
Well, I think after you do so, you ought to write about it and put it online. So I want to hear. I want to hear about that. And you know what I think is going to be a problem here. I think is that this is the first time we've ever talked, but I can already see we're going to probably go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole with things. I'm having a blast talking with you about music already. So I'm going to segue us into what you just brought up, and I was starting to bring up before, is you opening for Ray Manzarek. How long ago did that happen?
Yeah, it was December 2011.
Oh, okay.
It's about what is that, 12 and a half years ago?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, that sounds about right.
12 and a half years ago.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It was a year and a half before Ray passed away.
Oh, okay.
So it was like right at the end, but no one knew it was the end.
Yeah. And I know that before the show, you got to, well, first of all, you had already been a fan of his for many years at this point. He had been an influence on you, in some ways, I would think.
Oh, yeah. The Doors were, I mean, a massive influence on me from the age of 15 and still, I mean, all the way through, and I don't really care if there's a cliche involved with any of that, but like, Morrison and the songwriting and the deep baritone and Ray's style and their jazz influence and their blues influence. I mean, that's throughout everything I've done, and I mean, I'm not like a super fan. Like I don't, have like a bust of Morrison on the, somewhere in the house.
Same here.
But I was a Doors fan from the first time that I heard them. And I mentioned it in the story that I wrote. The first time I heard them, I was at my girlfriend's house, Luann. I won't mention her last name. She's got a good last name. Luann. She is from originally from Georgia, and we were in her bedroom, having fun.
Yeah.
And we were listening
playing bingo or something, I would imagine.
Yeah, we Parcheesi, and and she had a Doors poster on the wall, and she was playing them, and she pointed out the band, and she said she was in love with Jim Morrison, Jim, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got jealous.
Really?
Yeah, I was a 15-year-old jealous of a dead rock star. And honestly, I'm telling you, like it was maybe, 4 months after that I joined my first band, and
oh wow.
We did a lot of originals. We wrote most of our stuff, and so I wrote the lyrics, right? That was my gig. And so my stuff was very influenced by bands of the time, like REM and Michael Stipe and The Church and Steve Kilbey, and then Morrison,
Right.
And I wasn't playing in the band, but I was playing classical music you know, and contemporary stuff. So Ray didn't really have an influence on me in that band,
Hmm.
right? But the whole style of what they were doing and all that stuff, So but our, I think it was our very first, one of our very first gigs, if not our first, yeah, it was our first gig. One of the songs that we did was Roadhouse Blues.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. That's one of my
Yeah,
favorites.
it was like maybe we did 9 or 10 tunes, and 8 of them were originals, and 2 were covers, and one was, you know,
Oh, wow.
Roadhouse
That's really
Blues,
cool.
and another was like, the Ramones or something. Maybe it was like the Church, because we used to do Reptile, but
Oh, okay.
that was a one I really liked. But I mean, that was like staple, for the gigs that we did, and I remember the rush of what it was like to do that tune and do that whole middle section, where Morrison does his kind of bluesy thing, and
Hmm.
you know, I'm
It,
gonna feel my soul, all right, and then he
it's
comes to
such
the
a
part
cool
where he got,
song. It's one of
yeah,
my
it's just,
favorites, and what a
and he's like,
great
I woke
live
up
one.
this morning, I got myself a beer,
I was
like,
just going to mention that. I know, like, as I first heard that song when I was probably in my early teens, and back then, even if you had barely had beer, it was just something that was this wonderful thing that if people were singing about it, you're like, yeah, all right.
oh yeah, I have woke up and had myself a beer since then, but I had not at that
Me too,
time.
actually.
So, yeah, it was, and so it was really, it was bookends for me, like to have that. And then later on, it was 2011, and it was maybe like the summer, and my booking agent at the time, Steve Kaiser, he was booking my band, opening for a lot of different, uh kind of formerly famous,
Hmm.
probably still famous in certain circles, 60s bands. I shouldn't even say formerly. Like, we opened for Big Brother and the Holding Company, which
Right.
was
Oh,
Janis
wow.
Joplin's band. We opened for It's a Beautiful Day. We opened for Commander Cody.
Oh, wow. Very
We did
cool.
a no war rally with Lynn Woolsey, Senator Lynn Woolsey, and that was a shared bill. Gentry Bronson Band, to use my name, but that was the name of the band, the Gentry Bronson Band, and the Fish from Country Joe and the
Oh,
Fish.
wow. Oh, very
Yeah, so
cool.
he was on there, and we did. I can't think of, there were some other people in that. Those are the ones I could think of off the top of my head, but so I was kind of like in that world, and it was weird because they considered me the youngster, but I was like 38 years old, been doing it for a long
But you
time.
were the youngster to all them.
Yeah, and my band was, I mean, I guess my drummer Alex Aspinall was probably at the time 33 or so, so he was like the youngest member. And so Steve at one point says, "Oh yeah, I did some booking for Ray Manzarek," and I was like, "Really? Wow, man, I would flip, I would lose my mind if I could open for Ray Manzarek."
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
cool, man. Yeah, I'll book you
Yeah,
opening for
that
him.
must have blown your mind just hearing that.
Yeah, I was like, okay, and you know that was it.
Awesome. Oh,
He
that's
booked
so
me,
cool.
and it was about 4 months later that we were going to be opening for, it was the Manzarek Rogers band. And I had lots of gigs in between, and we were like pretty well-oiled machine when the gig came along. But it was really wild because by the time the gig rolled around, the venue that I was playing, which was called the Mystic Theater, which is in Petaluma, California, it's in Sonoma County, and it's like, if you know the Bay Area, you know where it is. But basically, you have San Francisco, and then you have Marin County, and then you have Sonoma County. So Petaluma is like 45 minutes from San
Oh,
Francisco.
okay.
And by the time the gig rolled around, I was living like 5 blocks from the venue.
Oh, wow. That's convenient.
Yeah, 5 blocks.
Wow.
Yeah. So like, uh, I mean, my load in was like, I could have rolled my gear down the street. Like, I had, I had parked further away than I lived for many days.
Right.
And so it was just wild. And it was California, so it was like 80 degrees in December, and they happened to be putting up this giant Christmas tree outside, and there's kind of like this square circle kind of thing outside of the
Oh,
venue. So
okay.
it's like
Sounds nice.
all these people were there. Yeah, it was very like it was really weird because it had this holiday aspect, but then it was like
Like 80
me and
degrees.
Ray were on the marquee, and it was just this weirdly it was the Mystic Theater, but and I didn't even realize till later that it was really mystical. Like it was very
Mhm.
weird. The whole thing was just weird. And I was really stoked. I mean, I was
Oh,
very
I
stoked,
bet.
but I was also like, uh, I was just very serenely calm. It was weird.
Oh,
Like
that's
everybody gets a little nervous before a gig. I
right.
mean, you
Yeah.
can ask Bruce Springsteen, and I'm sure he gets. You're supposed to. You're supposed to get a little.
Yeah.
And I was. I mean, I had a little bit of nerve, but I had this weird slow boil of calm. It was really weird.
Oh,
Like
wow.
I don't think I've ever been that calm and together before a gig.
Wow.
And
That is kind of mystical then, isn't it?
yeah, it was weird. And I knew because my buddy Tim, who lives in Minnesota, still he lives in St. Paul. We grew up together. So like we grew up driving around, getting high, listening to the Doors, being, doing what all kinds of shenanigans, acting like, delinquents and listening to the Doors. And so when he heard that I was going to open for Ray, he flew out.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, he was like he flew out, and I was honored, he was there. And he told me later, he was like, I've never seen you like that. Like you were so together. Uh so like it was just a weird bookend to get to, you know, be on stage and open for Ray and not, but the craziest part was actually hanging out with him before both of us played.
Yeah, that must have been really cool. I really enjoyed reading about that because when you well, I'll let you just continue on that because you approached him obviously.
Yeah, he had finished his sound check, and I mean the venue's it's like 500 capacity, so it's not small, it's not big,
Mm.
but it's empty, really high ceilings, typical old venue, like old vaudeville venue, turn of the century. So it's old creaky wood, smelled like old beer and cigarettes, even though nobody had smoked in there since 2000. And
That stuff sticks.
yeah, it's all, the floor's not sticky maybe, but still you can't really get it mopped.
It's been lived in.
And he was up there and I'm like, well, I gotta go say hi. I'm the
Right.
opener and, introduce myself. And I went, and the thing is Ray Manzarek looked identical to the Ray Manzarek that you've seen in concert videos with the Doors in 1970.
Wow, that's really
I mean,
something.
like, yeah, his hair was shorter and gray, but he looked identical. I mean, he hadn't aged. It was weird.
That is
He
weird. I
had
remember seeing
glasses
pictures
though.
of him in his last years, and he was remarkably similar to how he had looked when he was young.
Yeah, he was slender, and he had the jawline, and he still had glasses because he'd been wearing glasses the whole time. He didn't have the weird swoosh long hair.
Hmm.
But he just he and so I went up and introduced myself, and he was just super gracious and jumped off the stage and came down and just started talking to me,
That's awesome.
and not and it was there wasn't any ego at all. It was just two musicians hanging out.
That's
But
fantastic.
I had to tell him, like, look, man, you're a huge influence on me. I mean, like, I'm a pianist and keyboardist, and you influence my whole thing. And then he asked me if I was classically trained, and I said yeah, and that's when he started joking, and he said, yeah, I would have played classical, but I wasn't good enough, so I had to learn to play the blues. Yeah.
I think he might have been selling himself a little short there, right?
Yeah, and I was, so I'm like, well, man, you did a pretty good job, you know. And and we just started kind of chatting about stuff, and the stuff that I remember, because you know it's been 12 years now,
Mm.
but it was so indelible uh that we started talking about um you know, like the Grammys for some reason.
Oh,
And
okay.
I think I'd asked him, I was like, oh yeah, so you know, you play the blues, but you know, you ever played any polka? And he was like, no, but I voted for a polka band in the Grammys once, you know. And I
Just
was a
chatting
Grammy
about the
member.
Grammys with Ray Manzarek.
Yeah. And the weird thing was I was a Grammy member. So I was like, oh
Oh,
yes.
very cool.
So you know, yeah, I voted in the Grammys too, man. It's really,
That's
you
such
know,
a
it's
cool
kind of
thing.
yeah, it's like kind of a pain, you know. There's a lot to listen to. And he's like, yeah. And and then I said, well, did you know? And I mean, it's like as I'm talking, I was realizing everybody's around looking at us in this venue. But then I'm also like on my own camera, like I'm looking at myself like, dude, you're talking to Ray Manzarek about the Grammys, and now you're talking to him about polka. And then I said, hey man, did you know that Duke Ellington at the end of his life was writing polkas? That's what he was writing.
That's
Because he
really
was.
something.
That's what Duke Ellington
I
was
didn't
writing.
know that till I saw you write about it in that article.
Yeah, he did a lot of touring in Iowa and Wisconsin and stuff, and he wrote polkas.
Wow.
He got into polkas. He found them to be musically really interesting, and you can hear Duke Ellington's polkas from probably the
Wow.
70s, which was right before he died. So I said, "Did you know that?" And Ray was like, "Oh no," and he was like thrilled, you know.
Oh,
And
that's
that's,
so cool.
I mean, that's when it was like he felt like my crazy rock and roll uncle that I'd never met.
That is
And he's a little
that's
taller than me, and you know, and then it was like, okay, well, I got a sound check, and he's got to go back and check in with his band, and you know, and that's kind of how it works, you know. But I gotta say, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, I've been the headliner and I've opened for bands, and often the opener doesn't, you know, spend any time with the
hmm
opener. You might not even meet them.
right. I've
Might
heard
shake
that a
their
lot.
hand and they leave, or they're in their green room, or the door's shut, or whatever, you know. I always made a point of either meeting my opener or meeting the headliner, and then, but then at the same token, I would always go up to every bartender or door person and thank them. And that was like, I was probably over gracious, you know. But in this case, it was like, no, we're hanging out right now. That's what we're doing.
That's
We're
just
hanging out.
wonderful.
Yeah.
It really is. And go back a second. I don't think you were over gracious. I try to be the same. You know, you try to talk to everybody, and you know, everybody's got their own stories, and we're all kind of we're all connected in that. I don't know, in the different
Sure.
events that we were doing. But so I think that's wonderful, and yeah, that's so cool. You were just talking to him like you said, like he was your uncle, like a crazy, like a rock and roll uncle. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, you know, because he basically was.
Yeah, and
I mean, you know,
it's true. And you know, you talked about his influence on you, and you mentioned some other musicians that were popular when you started playing music, and I think he was probably a very big influence on, I would guess, many of them, because let's face it, the Doors were, they're like in a lot of people's top 5 or top 10 all-time favorite rock bands. I mean, they came into the rock music scene at gosh, one of the most interesting times in music. I mean, their first album came out in the mid 60s, and when you had so many other big bands breaking at the time. Of course, the Beatles had been around for a couple of years at that point, but the Stones and the Who and the Doors were so very unique. I mean, yes, they were a rock band, but they had different elements of different kinds of music. I was certainly towards the end, they were working more and more blues into their albums, and just such an amazing band. And if you don't mind, why don't we just talk about their first album? To me, I'm actually going to write an article soon about the first album. I do a series on Medium called First Album Reviews, where I just try to touch upon, you know, classic first albums, but even new ones. But to me, the first Doors album is one of the best debut albums ever by anyone. It's
totally agree.
yeah.
Agreed.
I mean, do you have any particular favorite songs on that one?
I mean, I think it's a nearly perfect album, if
I
not a
think so
perfect,
too.
or
Yeah.
maybe an over perfect album. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, you know, you have and I can just do this kind of almost from memory. Like Break On Through kicks off the album, and I mean, that's hard rock
Yeah.
before Zeppelin, you know, before Sabbath, like before Alice Cooper. Like that Robbie Krieger guitar line is it's metal,
Yeah.
it's hard rock. And then you got Morrison screaming, and I mean, it's like when they wrote that stuff, it was 66. That was recorded in 67, released in
Hmm.
60. I believe summer of 67 is when it came out.
Yeah.
And like summer, I mean, it's just like it blows open the doors, and it's also the doors. I mean, you get the pun there, but I mean, they're kind of like they do that, but then they by song 3 they're doing Crystal or
Yeah. Crystal Ship.
Ship, and there's a beautiful classically inspired piano solo in the middle of that song.
Hmm.
Ray's doing, and that I think when I heard that I was like, oh, I do that. Like
Wow.
I know that, right? But then on top of all of that, right? I mean, like even just from Break On Through, like Densmore he's playing a Latin style. He's cracking on the side of the snare, rim shots in a jazz style. So they're combining jazz, they've got blues in there, they've got rock, hard rock before hard rock even exists, maybe Smoke on the Water, that maybe I don't even know if that was then. Cream might have been doing something, but like
Right.
they're already doing that. And then you have Manzarek, who's playing the bass line with his left hand.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I've done that in different incarnations of things where I've played, and mostly live. I've never recorded that way really,
Hmm.
but that was something where I was like, you you can do that as a like that might have been the biggest influence on me, because that inspired my whole take on bass lines and bass
Oh
itself. I mean,
wow. How about
like
that?
even expressing that to bass players that I played with. Uh, I mean, and then by the time they get to the top of the second side, they're doing Backdoor Man. I mean, they're doing Willie Dixon. They're doing
Yeah.
straight blues, right? But
Exactly. Yeah. That kicked off the second
also,
side.
what's also key in there, and this is the thing that is important. So they got the jazz, they got blues, they got rock, they got hard rock, right? They've got the poetry, but they've also got theater,
Hmm. Yes.
stream theater. And when they do Kurt Weill's Alabama song, the whiskey song, that's straight out of, like cabaret style time. I mean, that's like, Berlin in the 30s,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I didn't know that until today. Just how old that song actually
yeah.
was. I think it was originally written in the 20s, but then, like you said, it just kept getting more and more popular.
And it's straight up theater, over the top, you know, uh, and it makes sense because Morrison and Manzarek met in film school, and they
Yeah, that's
always
right.
had theater and cinematicness in their songs. So like I don't want to jump ahead, but like by the time they get to Waiting for the Sun album, they've got Unknown Soldier, Spanish Caravan, and they would act out the whole Unknown Soldier where Morrison would stand on stage with a blindfold and they would shoot him.
Yeah, I saw that like Robbie would pretend to shoot
Yeah,
him and stuff like that. That's pretty wild.
and that was part of their whole shtick. And that's they haven't even gotten to the end yet. I mean, they haven't even gotten to
Yeah.
the true theater, which comes from Greek tragicomedy, which is the Oedipal elements that Morrison throws in through his LSD inspired trip, more than likely,
Yes, more than
at the
likely.
Whiskey a Go Go. But like, who knows? It's lore. It's rock and roll lore. It's like over
Exactly.
the top, right? It's like Bob Dylan when he decided to plug in. I mean, that's lore, right? That's
Hmm.
like larger. That's rock and roll mythology, right?
Yeah, it is. That's going to be talked about forever.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Beatles, performing on the rooftop and the police showing. I mean, these are things
Hmm.
that change more than just music, right? So like that album to me, and even the way it was marketed, like they had a billboard on the Sunset Strip in LA.
Hmm.
All those songs were already written and they recorded everything, I believe, in less than 10 days
That's amazing, isn't it?
for a debut album that
Yeah.
was, you know,
It's amazing when you look back at the Doors and so many other artists from back then, like the speed that was done with recording albums. Not only the recording process, but the amount of time between albums too, because it was just like that. Like you said, that was released in '67, and I think it was just 8 months later that their second album, Strange Days, came out. I
Strange
mean, it was,
Days,
and that
Strange
was a
Days.
regular thing back then for
Yeah.
artists.
Yeah.
And
Beatles, stuff like that. Yeah. And
yeah,
that might be, for me, that was something that maybe unconsciously influenced me because my albums were always made uh quickly. One reason was because of budget, but I would record everything live and quickly and capture everything in less than five
ah,
takes. That was really important. And I also released a lot of stuff, like I did 7 records between 2001 and 2006.
that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah. So I was really, so but I think at that time, being prolific was expected,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
The
because they were
Beatles,
also touring in addition to
yeah.
recording the albums and writing the music and
And Strange Days to me is equally as good
yeah.
as The Doors, The Doors. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's a fantastic album.
it's outstanding. I mean, from the opener, and it's very, like, I listened to it today, and the opener is, I mean, it's got a 60s vibe, but it's also got like, it could be psychedelic rock today.
Yeah, it could. It
You
could.
know?
It's true. And for, I want to just bring this up just briefly for those who there might be some people listening to this or watching this who are not overly familiar with the members of the Doors. So I just want to briefly touch upon who was in the band. We've of course mentioned Jim Morrison, who was a very charismatic lead singer and the main lyricist for the band, although he wasn't the only one who wrote lyrics for the
Not
band.
the only one.
No, no, not the only one. And then we had mentioned Ray Manzarek, who was on the keys, and Robbie Krieger was their guitarist, and John Densmore was their drummer. And you know, Gentry had touched upon this, and that's that how Ray played the bass line. The Doors did not have a bass player. A lot of people don't know that. They're one of the few, like I think, very famous bands who did not have a bass player. They occasionally, I think, had some people playing bass on the albums, and
Yeah.
I assume it was. I don't know if they did it out on the road or not, or if.
On the
But
road, I don't think they ever did.
yeah, I don't think they did. But to me, that's always been amazing that this band did not have this. One of the most famous rock bands ever didn't have a bass player.
Yeah. And I mean, that on album you can tell where there's a real bass player used, but
Hmm.
I don't think I've ever seen them live with a bass player. And the other thing that doesn't really get talked about is when Morrison he was a rock star, and he was kind of, he was, I consider the other thing that I want to make sure that we discuss is that the Doors were arguably one of the very first punk rock bands.
Yeah, yeah, you're right.
Iggy Pop says that when he saw the Doors in Detroit, that's when he became a singer. He was not in a
Wow,
band until he was like, I'm Jim Morrison is my boilerplate.
wow. How about that?
Yeah.
That's pretty
And if
cool.
you see, and Iggy's whole thing really, from the leather pants and the shirt, and the mannerisms, like he's borrowing from Morrison, right? And he'll say this, like it's not so the Stooges wouldn't exist without the Doors, but a lot of that whole aesthetic,
Hmm.
this is a time when, they were. I'm also a secret goth. People would never know that about. A lot of people don't know that about me, but I love goth music. I love Bauhaus and Sisters of Mercy and Joy
Oh,
Division.
okay, very
Yeah,
cool.
and so the Doors were, to me, the first goth band. The other band that would be parallel with them would be the Velvet Underground, right?
Hmm.
I mean,
Right.
they were dark leather and writing lyrics about S&M and whatever, so they were punk rock and they were goth as much as the Doors, but that was it.
Hmm.
There wasn't anybody else doing that. Maybe Scott Walker,
Oh,
uh,
okay, yeah.
doing some stuff, probably even before, but like, I mean, everybody always influences everybody else, but I think you hear all that on the first album, and then Strange Days, it just carries right through. It's the same year. They're still doing this dark thing. I mean, it's got The classics of all classics. I mean, People Are Strange is on there, and
Oh
then it's
yeah.
got another epic, which is When the Music's Over.
Yes. Yeah, and
There's an
like that was
environmental
the
song
closer
in
on
there.
that album, just like that was the epic on that one, just like the end had been the epic on the first album.
And in it, Morrison is talking about ecology and, uh, the the earth and how, they ripped her and bit her. And, I mean, he's like, he, to me, there's a lot of layers to those things, but also you listen to the music, it's got a lot of jazz.
Yeah, it does.
A lot.
Yeah, and that's an album that I didn't. I first got in, I was telling you before we started recording, and I'll just tell everyone else that I got into the Doors probably in my freshman year of high school. That was shortly after the famous biography "No One Here Gets Out Alive" had come out, and there was like this resurgence in popularity of the Doors at that point, and there were Morrison posters for sale, like every store you went in, shirts, all that kind of stuff. And I think a part of it too was what you brought up earlier. They were punk in a lot of ways, and especially Jim. Jim was like, for a teenager like me, Jim was this great rebellious character. You saw it in the videos that at that time were showing up on MTV, and
Mm.
the old concert footage, and just listening to these songs. His lyrics were so quote unquote bizarre, compared to a lot of other things where he was a rebel. And of course, teenagers embraced that. And not just teenagers. I mean, people of all ages. You saw that there was this punkness about him, or I don't know, just this. He was quite the front man for the Doors. It was such a talent.
There are a few front people that you can kind of harken back to, like the beginnings of things, and him and Jagger.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, often they've got a guitar in their hand, right? Or they've got piano, like Jerry Lee Lewis, right? There's an instrument, but there aren't that many that are just up there, bare
yeah.
bones.
Exactly. And in one moment, he could be screaming, just lyrics that are just really kind of out there. But then he'll sing like some beautiful slow song, and it just sound amazing singing a ballad.
Yeah.
And such a talent. And like you said, this album is amazing. Started off with Strange Days, and one of my favorites on it was came after that, Your Lost Little Girl. I like
Oh
that song a
yeah,
lot.
great song. Yeah.
And then Love Me Two Times was the big hits, one of the big hit singles off of that.
The keyboard solo on that was,
Mhm.
I mean, I basically just emulated that in just about every solo I've ever done. I think, like
Oh,
there's,
that's awesome.
yeah, it's like I never got it, but that's like in my head from, you know,
Well, the
maybe it's
keyboard
because
singing
like,
are so good.
yeah, it's just he's got this arpeggiated thing that he does. That's really, I want to like sing it, but I'm not, it doesn't,
But
yeah.
what's amazing is, and this is another thing you and I were talking about before we started recording, is that I mentioned just a minute ago that Jim Morrison is the first thing that drew me in to the Doors and maybe become such a big Doors fan. But as I've gotten older, it's not that I never didn't appreciate the other members of the Doors, but I listen to their stuff now, and sometimes I'll listen to an album in its entirety and I'll be just so blown away by the music in it. I'll be like, oh, listen to what Ray did there, or listen to what Robbie Krieger just did there. And sometimes some of Morrison's lyrics didn't do it for me. Maybe sometimes they were a little too wild, but the music would rope me back in. Where I like some of the songs more for music than for the lyrics. And more often than not, though, they all gelled together really well, I think.
Yeah, I use a term in the story that you read. It's like rock and roll circus music,
Yes.
because there are times where you're just like, you feel like you're in this ridiculous circus, and the organ, I think, really lends it to that whimsical quality.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening today, and I can't, and it was one of the albums we haven't gotten to yet, but like they musically were doing kind of prog rock stuff. I mean,
It's
they
true.
would switch time signatures, and they would do stops, and they would do things that were not, they weren't doing CCR, they weren't doing, Crosby, Stills and Nash. I mean, they were doing like pretty ornate
Mm-hmm.
instrumentation. And then they would do like a lot of like weird waltz things and stuff that they would just
Yeah.
put in there, like,
Uh-huh.
I mean, I mean, Moonlight Drive, which is on that's not a 3/4 time, but like that one's got some really interesting stops and the piano work and the way that the band is playing back and forth. You know, it's like that's I think what makes it a kind of a timeless quality.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I was reading a little bit about the making of this album, and I read some clips of an interview with Paul Rothschild. He was the producer of their first five albums. He wasn't for their final studio album with Jim Morrison, but he said that in this interview, he had said that he thought that Strange Days was the best Doors album through and
Mhm.
through. He thought, they had everything going on there, and he said at the time they actually expected the album to be bigger than it was. I mean, it was successful. It had
Mhm.
a couple of singles on it, but it didn't reach the financial success, I guess, that the first album had. So it's
Oh,
in some ways, I think the record labels and we're looking at like, hey, you guys need to pick it up a little bit on the next album. But yeah,
and
I think
yet
it's a
both albums were released the same year.
exactly. So cut them a little slack
I
here. I mean,
mean,
Love Me Two
wow.
Times was a hit, and People Were Strange was a hit from it. I mean, they did okay.
Yeah. I mean, like, both albums in 1967, like that was the year Sergeant Pepper's came out. Like,
Exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
it's not as though it wasn't a competitive year for music. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. You had Sergeant Pepper, and then
yeah, I mean, you had like, White Rabbit by, Jefferson Airplane. I mean, I mean, it was like Jimi Hendrix first album came out in 67, like
yeah,
it was
and you
not.
had, I mean, so many big things. Now, I know this, it couldn't be much more different than the Doors, but I'm a big fan of the Monkees, and that was a big
Oh
year for
yeah,
them. They had a couple
sure.
big albums that year, and so, like you said, there was so much competition. The Beach Boys were still flying high off of Pet
Oh yeah,
Sounds and
absolutely. Jethro
Good
Tull put
Vibration.
out, I believe, Stand Up came out that year, maybe.
hmm Yeah, that was
Um,
quite a year. I mean,
yeah, I
so
mean,
the powers that be
Magic.
should have cut them a little slack there. That it sold a little bit less than the first album. But yeah, so many good songs we mentioned already. Of course, "Strange Days," "Your Lost Little Girl," "Love Me Two Times," "People Were Strange," "Moonlight Drive." I like too. I can't see your face in my mind. That's one towards
Oh
the
yeah.
end of the album. Yeah, that's a good song. I mean, not one I'd say that I love, but I'll listen to it. That's one that I don't think I dug too much when I was younger, but now I'm like, oh, that's a nice song.
Well, I mean, I don't want to reach, but I'm realizing that there were a lot of things that I got introduced to, I think, through the Doors and like Horse Latitudes. It's spoken word poetry.
Mm-hmm.
It's very abstract
Yes.
music, right? So like at that time, I was probably listening to a lot of like Revolution Number 9 from the White Album and
Right.
stuff like that. But that stuff, that's the roots of that's avant-garde, right? That's
Yes, definitely.
avant-garde music, at least the stuff that I've done and the more dissonant stuff that's out there, like that's where it comes from is that, right? And I know that it influenced me personally to get into jazz and then blues. I was a huge Stevie Ray Vaughan fan at like 17. And
Oh wow.
I don't think that it would have happened had I not heard, blues related stuff and not even knowing that jazz was what it was and they were doing. I mean, Densmore's a jazz drummer
Yeah. He's an
for sure.
amazing, a very underrated drummer, I think.
Yeah.
Just so good.
And I mean, I don't want to move forward to the next album, but like Krieger he could do flamenco, he could do slide guitar, he did a
Yeah.
lot of, um, and I have other weird parallels with him. Like when I first left Minnesota, moved to the West Coast, I was a prep chef for an East Indian chef who was from LA who had moved to Oregon. That's where I lived. His band used to share bills with the Doors.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, and he
Wow.
kind of looked like Robbie Krieger when he was younger. So they would share bills at the whiskey.
Oh,
And he had
wow.
pictures of himself hanging out with those guys, because his band would either open for them or vice versa. They would trade off.
Oh, wow. How about that?
Yeah. So I would hear, and he eventually married his wife, and she signed Jethro Tull and she signed the Grateful Dead, and she worked for Polygram. She
You know
signed
such boring people, Gentry, I'll tell you.
she signed Michael Jackson when he went solo. I mean,
Wow. Okay, that's
yeah.
all
So
pretty
and
cool.
at that time, like, I was 18 years old. So I was just like, it just continued to fuel this weird fire of what. this mind-blowing stardom that people have been a part of, and this connection to this band.
Hmm.
So, I mean, maybe it was, maybe that was always the trail that. So when I finally got to open for Ray, it was kind of like, well, I guess this is just where it's supposed to have led, right?
Right. Maybe that's why you were at ease at that moment, you know.
Yeah, I was like, well, okay, man.
It was meant to be.
But I mean, I lived a lot longer than Morrison. You and
Yeah.
I both have, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing is Morrison is part of the 27 Club, and
Hmm.
so I mean, all the stuff that they were doing, he wrote a lot of his stuff at 2021, and their last album came out when he was 27, and that was it.
Yeah. I know that's something that's always blown my mind is just how much good music they put out in such a small period of time. I mean, like you said, I think the first album came out in '67, and the last one with him was '71. I mean, that's
Yeah.
6 studio albums in that time, but so many classics on them.
Well, when you
And
move on from Strange Days, I mean, I don't want to speed you along, but Waiting for the Sun, which I listened to today.
oh, we're just gonna skip that one.
You
No,
want
I'm
to see
kidding. I'm
Waiting
no,
for
no,
the
no, I'm
Sun?
kidding. I'm kidding.
I mean, Waiting for the Sun has got, I mean, Hello, I Love You. The keyboard work on that sounds like an EDM style keyboard on dance music today, right?
Yeah,
Like,
isn't that something? Yeah,
yeah.
let's just go right to that album then. That was like we said, their third album came out in July 1968, and it was such a great album. I mean, "Hello, I Love You" opened the album. I mean, my goodness, what a great song!
And I mean, in the middle, Spanish Caravan,
Yeah,
I mean, what are they? I mean, talk about Krieger, man. I mean, that's some guitar playing. That's
yeah.
flamenco guitar.
That opening guitar playing, especially, wow, what
Incredible.
an open!
And then he ends up burning the same line with an electric guitar that is precursor to hard rock, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they were a hard rock band. They called them that at the time.
Hmm.
And I mean that song, and then just before that, yeah, just before that is The Unknown Soldier, which is high theater that ends in a great, glorious like celebration,
Yeah,
right?
it does. I was surprised to learn. I didn't realize that was actually the first single released from the album. That kind of
Oh,
surprised. That
interesting.
kind of surprised me when I learned that this week. I mean, I think it's a great song, but it's not one that you would think a record company would say, "Hey, let's put that out to compete with the Beatles or other
So that
things that were
came
popular."
out before Hello, I Love You, huh?
Yeah, yeah, it did, and
Wow.
it peaked at only 39, which isn't bad, of course, on the Hot
Yeah.
100.
Yeah.
But and then "Hello, I Love You" became their second number one single because we didn't mention, but "Light My Fire" had been a number one off the first
Right.
album. But yeah, "Unknown Soldier." That's one that I appreciate. That's what the kind of thing I talked about earlier, where I appreciate it more now as an adult. I think than maybe
Yeah.
when I was a teenager. It's you just listen to everything that's going on in it, and like you said, it's got a lot, it's got a lot going on in it.
Theatric, and it's also anti-war in
Yeah.
1968, right? I mean, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Street Fighting Man, the Stones were doing that. This was kind
Mhm.
of like the Doors way of, you know, I can't think of any outwardly anti-war song from the Doors more so than that one.
Yeah, I agree. I
Right? I
agree.
mean,
They definitely had other ones
Vietnam's,
where they might have referenced stuff that was going on, but you're right. That's
yeah,
the one that's most, obvious with it. And well, there's
and
just so many good songs.
5 to 1
Yeah,
is, I mean, that's minimal blues meets hard rock. I mean, it's just like that bass. I mean, that bass line is so simple, but it's so stamping.
yeah.
Just like,
That was the closing song on this album. It was a really great closer, and that's where I mentioned that the book "No One Here Gets Out Alive." That line came from that song.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
such a great song. And one of that I like on here a lot too is there was only two singles released from this album. It was "The Unknown Soldier" and "Hello, I Love You." Now the flip side of "Hello, I Love You" was "Love Street,"
I
and
love that song.
yeah, I do too. And I think I think that could have been a hit on its own if they had maybe. I know it's not all about hits and what sells well, but I think that would have been a good single release too. I think that's a fantastic song.
It's a swing jazz tune. Michael
Yeah,
Bublé could do that song.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
awesome.
Sinatra could have done that song. Like
It's
it's just
true.
like it's this swing jazz song,
You
but
can
it's
hear Sinatra singing the la 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 la's at the.
oh yeah. But it's straight out of the other element for me, because I lived in California for 20 years, is the Doors are very California and very SoCal, very Southern California. Now I lived in San Francisco, but there is a deep Californianess to the Doors.
Oh
They you
yeah.
can just you get that. You get the ocean out of it, right? You get the beach. You get you certainly get LA, right? I mean, there's an LA quality that influenced a lot of the LA punks later, like X, and Gun Club and people like that. Gun Club had the deep baritone. So like Love Street to me has a very Venice Beach in the late 60s kind of vibe, like flower power, love song, but with a swanky swing, you know?
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
and I get that. Like it's just that's the when they get into their more kind of hippie vibe stuff, you really get this flavor for the circus elements that were so vibrant in Venice Beach at that time that I imagine, since I wasn't alive.
Right.
But I think that that's when they really embrace the era, that's a song that encapsulates it, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. And
And then they
another
just
one.
burn it all down with 5 to 1.
Yeah. And speaking of embracing the era, I mean, that like you had said before, I think we both touch upon is they embrace so many different things that were happening at that time period. Like one of the next, I think it might actually be the next song is "Not to Touch the Earth." I mean, that one,
Oh,
I've seen
yeah.
that many describe that as being, an early psychedelic song or sort of like avant rock. That's
Yeah. Well, I don't know in your research if you figure this out, but that is from a longer piece that was intended for Waiting for the Sun
Mhm.
called Celebration of the Lizard.
Right.
And you can hear the Celebration of the Lizard on one of their live albums, and I can't think of which one it is. I think it's Live Alive. Is that one of
Oh,
them?
maybe "Alive She Cried."
Alive She Cried. That's it.
Oh,
Alive
okay.
She Cried. I believe they do the entire Celebration of the Lizard on there.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I know of the album, but I've never heard it. I'll have to listen to that.
So that was their intention. The band was the label put the kibosh on that. They said, no, you can't do one whole side Celebration of the Lizard. You can't do what Thick as a Brick is that Jethro Tull did just literally, 2 years later for a whole album. They weren't allowed to do a whole side as a piece, so they broke it into that one
Well, and
song.
that one ends famously with the line, "I am the Lizard King. I can do anything," which, you will see people with tattoos that say the Lizard King. You will still see
Yep.
the Lizard King. It's become this big, big thing.
Celebration of the Lizard, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Which is
Exactly.
also very SoCal desert, Joshua Tree. Like there's just like you don't get like you have to be able to live some of those things. Like I mean that to me uh it has the same motifs as like a Queens of the Stone Age song,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
straight out of the desert, right? Like that's kind of what they were, you know, there's
Yeah.
a lot of foundational stuff there.
It's really just also amazing, and I mean, this album's it's a really good album. It's one that I didn't really know all that well back when I started getting into the Doors. I think one of it was probably the same for you when you were a teenager. You if you didn't have an album, one of your buddies did, and you would hear a little bit of it, or you'd end up playing the same one or two songs over and over again. So
Uh-huh.
it's not an album I really knew till maybe even the past 10 years, but it's got some good stuff on there, like. Summer's Almost Gone, I think is good. I really like Ray's got some really nice playing in that one. And
Yeah.
Wintertime Love, that's got some good lines in it. And we
Yeah, they got
mentioned,
the seasonal thing there. They got the winter and the summer thing. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, it's
fun.
just, and we already mentioned Spanish Caravan, and just some good stuff. It's a good album. And I wanted to go into the next album if I can. This is actually one of my favorite albums. A lot of people,
Morrison Hotel, huh?
no,
Oh no,
the
the
soft,
Soft
the
Parade.
Soft Parade.
Oh,
Uh,
sorry, I skipped Morrison
Oh,
Hotel.
that's
Soft
okay.
Parade. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
the Soft Parade. This I think got some from what I understand, it got some flack from some people when it came out. They thought
That's
maybe
their sellout album,
yeah, their
quote unquote.
sellout album because their producer actually was very instrumental in them using horns and strings on this album. Paul Rothschild. He suggested that
Yeah.
they maybe try some different things, and also this was different because my research has shown me that Morrison. Well, we know he went through a lot at different times, whether it was drugs or anxiety, but this was a particularly hard time for him, and he didn't do as much songwriting on this one. And Robbie Krieger ended up doing a lot of the songwriting on this album, and I like the album a lot. I think maybe it's one of my favorites because it was probably I think after the first album it was the first one that I actually owned a copy of myself.
Oh, okay.
I had the
Okay.
cassette tape of this in the 80s, and I would just, play side A, flip it over, play side B, and just over and over and over again. So this one, maybe a
I
lot of
don't think
people.
I've ever heard anybody say that the Soft Parade was their favorite Doors album. So it's interesting to get your perspective though. Now I have no problem with, I'm like a big fan of, when I was back there in
Lies back there
seminary
in
school,
school. Yeah,
there was,
exactly.
like I think the Soft Parade, their lengthy epic end song, like the end and like when the
Yeah.
music's over, I think it's awesome. I
That's
love
my favorite
that
thing
song.
on the album. I love the soft rate and that part that you just mentioned, the beginning where Jim is doing that little rant. You
Oh my
petition
God.
the Lord with prayer.
Yeah. And
And I think
then they
too.
go into like that like kind of weird lullaby kind of thing,
Yeah,
give me
it's
sanctuary. Right?
yeah. And then it gets into like this really funky sounding music,
Yeah. Yeah.
where
And then
they're
it's
singing
like
about
then the 70s come into play. Way
yeah.
before the 70s are even here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you got some lines in there like where I wrote down some of my favorites where Jim is saying like peppermint mini skirts, chocolate candy,
Yeah.
and then it gets like where it's light and kind of fluffy almost, but then he talks about
Yeah. And then it
one is
goes,
to love your neighbor until his wife gets home. So suddenly it
yeah,
goes from
until his
like
wife gets home, and then it goes dun 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 dun. Yeah, and then there's
yeah,
the
and
whole
I
like
always love
weird.
that part. That dun, dun, dun,
Yeah.
dun, dun. To me, it sounded like I don't know the music you'd hear like in a '70s sitcom. It could be like playing at the
Oh yeah.
beginning of The Odd Couple or something
Oh
like
yeah.
that. But then it gets into this really long, just jam.
Right after Morrison says, and the monk bought
Bought
lunch.
lunch. Yeah, he bought a little. I don't know if it's Robbie talking to him there, and then Jim just sounds like he's lost his mind. It's like this is the
Oh
trip,
yeah.
the best part. I really like, and then they're like, "What did he say?" It's
Yeah,
just like,
it's I think it's I love that song. I think
yeah,
it's,
that's
and
my
the other
favorite.
song I actually really like on that album is Easy Ride.
Oh yeah, that's a great song.
Yeah,
I
well,
like
I
this
mean
one.
it sounds like lunacy,
Yeah.
and it sounds like that rock and roll circus stuff, right? Like
Yes.
I think that when they veer, now I mean I appreciate the use of horns, but I think that in the rock and roll world, people say like, oh, when you use horns too much, that's when you've sold out or whatever.
Mhm.
People don't even talk, that's not even a term people use anymore, but like I remember when the Replacements, that's a band that we brought up, like when they brought in horns on Can't Hardly Wait on the Please to Meet Me album, like that was a moment where people were like, oh yeah, that's kind of like that's the end of the Replacements, for some people.
Right.
And I think that's what people thought with the Soft Parade. But I definitely don't agree. Like I think that the big sax solo on Touch Me is
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. I love Touch Me, and I think around the time I got this album too in the early '80s was when I mentioned MTV. MTV was playing the hell out of the music video for Touch Me. I think they had been on. I don't think it was the Ed
Oh,
Sullivan Show because
it-
they might have been banned from that at this
they were
point. But
banned from that. Yeah.
yeah, they were on something else, and they played the video a lot, and I love that song. That's a perfect example of what I said earlier is that Morrison could, rock his ass off, but then he could do a slower song like that. And the man had a great voice, whether he was doing rock or slower songs, he was a good singer.
He could do blues. He could do kind of a Sinatra-esque thing. He could,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that people don't give him credit for actually being able to really sing. I mean, he can
Yeah.
sing. You
Yeah.
know, and
Yeah. I mean,
I wanted to bring up something that I didn't bring up when I was going to bring it up before, which is that when Morrison was too screwed up to perform,
mhm.
the person that did the singing was Ray.
See, I didn't know
They
that.
would do
Wow.
concerts. Yeah,
Wow.
so there was a concert and Jim couldn't perform, right? Ray did it. Ray
Wow.
sang Touch Me, Light My Fire, all that stuff.
I didn't know that. I
Played
didn't know
as a
that.
trio. Yeah.
Oh, how about that?
That's
So I knew that
so
Robbie sang a little bit, like shared a little bit of the vocals even on this album with Jim, but I didn't know Ray did that. That's pretty cool.
Ray would become the lead singer, the default lead singer when Morrison couldn't play. Now,
Wow.
of course, there were canceled shows because of riots or whatever,
Yeah.
but like there were times where they would just be like, "Well, I'm gonna sing," right?
Wow.
Yeah, and
Wow.
Ray pulled it off. I mean, I know I watched him.
I know. That's one of the things I loved about your article. Just saying, it was so cool to watch, this man who was there, who was one of the writers of the songs, actually, singing it, even though he didn't sing it originally, and that must have been well. And there and a couple other songs in this album. It's a fairly short album. A big bulk of it is the song "The Soft Parade," which, as I said, is my favorite.
Wishful Sinful is one that I've always liked.
I've always liked that one a lot too. I was going to mention I've got a little star next to it here as being one of my favorites on there, and this is one too. Like it's Robbie Krieger wrote that one. It's a great song, and they got a song too, "Runnin' Blue," where it starts off
Oh
with
yeah.
the whole poor Otis dead and gone, and which I didn't know until now was like a reference to Otis Redding since he had recently died.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that until today, unless the
Got a
article I
little
read was from.
bluegrass influence and some fiddle in there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
That they
that album's got some good stuff on it. I like that a lot. And let's
Wild Child Full of Grace,
yeah,
that's a
yeah,
good one.
that's a good tune. I mean, it's just a fun album. And again, I know it's not everyone's favorite, but I like it a lot. And well, let's go on to the one that you mentioned that is one of their most popular and most loved, and I think most critically acclaimed albums. That was their fifth one, Morrison Hotel, which came out in February of 1970. It's just a few days before my fourth birthday. I see
Oh
this.
wow. Okay.
Now, I don't remember it from back then, but I've certainly grown to love it since then. And that started with a song that you mentioned. It's one of my favorite songs by the Doors, and that's Roadhouse Blues, which is
Mhm.
just amazing. Always
Yeah, I
been one
mean
of my favorites.
it's a rock and roll staple. I mean it's you can't argue with the power of that song.
No, you
It's
can't. And here's another thing I was surprised at is that when that was released as a single, that was the B side of the single for "You Make Me Real."
oh,
Which
interesting.
really surprised me because I like "You Make Me Real." I think it's a good song,
Yeah.
but I never knew that that was supposed to be the A side. I think it was one of those situations where probably the DJs got a hold of it and made
Like, hey,
Roadhouse
we're
Blues
gonna
be the
throw on the B side. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
That's
that's really
wild because it's the first track on the album. So,
yeah. I know you would think but
I gotta say, I put on Morrison Hotel is the album that I played the least of the six studio albums they did.
mhm,
And so I have less attachment to it than the other albums because I have all kinds of life moments that are attached to the
right.
other albums. But Morrison Hotel, I put on today and I was like, wow, there's a lot of really good stuff in here that
Yeah,
I'm like just kind not just discovering, but kind of like hearing it felt like like the second time,
yeah, yeah.
like I mean I love The Spy. I've always loved
Yeah.
what is it, The Spy of Love, or is it the
Just
Spy?
well, yeah. In the House of Love, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
The House of, yeah, I've
Yeah, it's
always
one of
loved
my
that.
favorites on the and I'm really glad to hear you say this about maybe not knowing this album as quite as well as the others. 'Cause I'm the same way. I've known the album and I've heard it for decades, but not as well as I am attached to the other ones. So this is
Yeah.
one where, as I was getting ready for this show, I was listening to it really for the first time in many years,
Mhm.
and I went through the same experience as you. I'm like, wow, this is better even than I remember. It does have a lot of good music on it.
And the production quality on it too. I didn't remember it being what it was. Like
Hmm.
it's pared down because they had received flack about the soft parade. But in my mind, I was like, oh, it was like that was when they tried to re-embrace the blues. But it's not really that. Like
Mm-mm.
they isn't Peace Frog on that album, or is that
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's
it's-
like the fourth
yeah.
track in there.
So I mean, like that's a pretty classic Doors song,
It
and it's
is. It
like
is.
wah wah kind of thing that Robbie Krieger's doing. And like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's some like Maggie McGill, I think, is on there too,
Yeah, that's a
right?
closing track on the album.
Closer.
Yeah.
Uh,
Land
I'm
Ho, I
just, I'm
like. That's what I
literally
went
doing
to.
all this stuff off the top of my head. Like I
That's
have no
pretty impressive.
notes.
I got notes here. I don't know how you're doing it.
I have, I I have a pretty good memory, but there are certain bands that I really have,
Yeah.
I can attach. I When I was a little kid, they used to say I had a photographic memory, but I don't have that. What I do think I have is I have an audiographic memory, so I can
Yeah.
attach certain songs and albums and even like stuff. I attach it to certain moments in my life. So,
Right.
and that's why I said that about Morrison Hotel, because I don't have specific attachments. So when I hear it, it's like, wow, I feel like I want to listen to Morrison Hotel all week long now, you know?
Right. Yeah. I know what you mean.
Like I really want to re-embrace that album, you know?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel the same. I feel the same way about that, and actually, L.A. Woman. L.A. Woman's another one that I don't have the biggest attachment to for whatever reason. I think part of it too is like you look. It's like I know, like for example, the first album and the Soft Parade. I remember I used to listen to those a lot with my brother, and we would just like have a great time jamming to that and listening to them over and over again. So you have those, like you said, you have those memories and attachments. So those make
Yeah.
a difference in what we listen to and what we love, and yeah, and Morrison Hotel, I found myself really appreciating this and thinking, this was one of the last albums that well, it was their second to last album with Jim, and boy, what would have happened if Jim didn't pass? I mean, it's you can't really play the what if game,
And
but
that one is such a, because with them, the Doors became bigger. I think they became bigger than they were when they were around
yeah, I think you're right.
after he passed, right? Like
Yeah,
I read something uh recently that, after like their resurgence came because of the end and
mhm,
Coppola putting it in Apocalypse Now in both the beginning and the end, right? And splitting it up.
right.
And so they had a resurgence, and then No One Here Gets Out Alive, the book came, and so that even brought the resurgence further up. Um, so much so that Morrison was on the cover of Rolling Stone in 1981 with a line. I think the line was, "He's hot, he's sexy, he's dead."
Yes. Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. I remember that.
And he was dead. He'd been dead
Yeah,
for a decade, right?
yeah.
But
Although
he
some
was
refuse to believe that, but
right. Some still do. He and
yeah.
Elvis might be playing, poker somewhere here in New Orleans. Uh, but what's interesting is when I discovered the Doors, it wasn't until like 87, right? Because I
Mhm.
was 15. And there was another resurgence of kind of like the 60s thing had come back at that time, right? There were movies and music and lots of stuff. And I remember, the vampire movie, The Lost Boys.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well,
There's something.
Echo and the Bunnymen did People Are
That's
Strange, the
right. I forgot
soundtrack
about
of that.
that.
And there was some kind of cinematic reference to uh, Jason, the actor. I can't
Oh
think of his
yeah.
name now. He's the main character. He's the
Right.
one
Right.
from Vampire. I can't think of his last name, but
Jason Patrick.
Jason Patrick, he looked like Morrison, and
Yeah.
they at one point put Morrison's picture kind of over his, right?
Hmm.
So there was another resurgence of the Doors in the late 80s. And so kind of like they keep coming back, right? They keep bringing, so the lore of kind of Morrison and stuff in a way overshadowed the band. And that I don't want to happen, because the band was so good and so instrumental and so mind-blowing. And I think that maybe when Ray died in May 2013, people did go back and go, "Oh, wait a second. Oh,
Hmm.
yeah, there
Right.
was a band here that did this incredible stuff that changed everything as much as,
Yeah,
just
it's
one
true.
dude on stage with in leather pants."
Yeah.
Um,
They were just such an amazing band, and yeah, there was that. I remember that resurgence again, like you said, in the late '80s, and I think maybe to a lesser degree in the early '90s when you had the movie come out, the one that Val Kilmer had starred in.
oh yeah, sure, 91, yeah.
91, and that was a bit controversial. I don't want to get too far ahead, but I know like Ray himself had some issues with that. I think
Mhm.
Robbie Krieger had some issues with. I know Robbie had some issues with the biography that we mentioned too, saying that some of it really didn't represent Jim the way he really was, and
Sure, yeah.
maybe they were playing up some of his theatrics and drug usage. So I'm not to
Rock
say
and
that that
roll
was.
mythology,
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
they've done it for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One last thing. You mentioned Jason Patrick. I like to put this trivia out there for those who don't know this, which I always found this astounding, is Jason Patrick is the grandson of Jackie Gleason, who many people.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. When I found that out, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. But he is Jackie Gleason's grandson.
oh, I did not know that. I'm
Yeah, they
glad you
were not
brought that up.
close, but that's a whole other story. But
Crazy. Wow. Okay.
yeah, but we'll go back to Morrison Hotel. I'm trying to look at my list to see if there's anything here we didn't mention. But one that I like a lot is towards the end is Indian Summer. Just
Oh yeah.
I like
Mhm.
Robbie's guitar work in that. It's kind of a chill song, but it's just it's a good tune.
Well, I'm glad Indian Summer is a great song, but I do want to bring something up because I want to know in your research what you found here. So when I was listening today, I was listening on Spotify because, that's where it was easiest.
Yeah, I agree.
And Waiting for the Sun, the song, is not on the Waiting for the Sun album.
No, yeah, it's on this
It's
one.
on Morrison Hotel,
Yeah,
but it sounds like it should be on the Waiting for the Sun album.
yeah, and I don't know what the deal is with that. If they were working on it at the time and just didn't put it on the album, I didn't look into that any further. Now I kind of want to.
Because I feel like I had a cassette tape because I am,
Right. Yeah. No,
in the
you and me
same
both.
decade as
But
you.
I had some of these things on 8 track. So,
Oh, I love that. Oh, I hope you still have this. I remember Waiting for the Sun. In my memory, it was on the Waiting for the Sun album. And I did at one point have that was the first vinyl I had of the Doors, and maybe the only vinyl I had uh that was new. And it was Waiting for the Sun, and Waiting for the Sun was on the vinyl.
wow, that's really
So,
wild.
so I'm not sure, like, was it a reissue? Was
Yeah.
Waiting for the Sun originally on the original and not, and now it's on
Yeah. I
Morrison
don't know.
Hotel?
I want to say it wasn't on the original. Maybe it was a reissue.
Because
It's,
that keyboard line, that big blossoming kind of EDM sounding keyboard combined with the bass and the guitar, like the bum bum ba ba da,
right.
that sounds like it's from the Waiting for the Sun album.
It
It
does.
doesn't sound like the Morrison Hotel album.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if maybe yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was on the original and then it was cut or they changed things up. I really don't know. Now I got to check that out.
Well, I'm breezing that by you today because I was like, this doesn't fit for me here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I've seen different artists do that at times though, where they'll have a song and on a later album that, and it might even be the title of an earlier album. I remember the Hall and Oates did that with one, and I think it was bigger than both of us. It wasn't, or one of those back then where
Okay.
the song didn't come till much later. But yeah, regardless, it's a great song. I love the song. Waiting for the Sun is one
Yeah.
of my favorites on this, and You Make Me Real is a good rocker on
Oh
here.
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I like that one.
Is
And
that the
again,
one
it's an
that's
album
kind of
that I
a
appreciate.
throwback? Like it's got a bit of a rock and roll throwback to it.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's got a
yeah,
real kind of like straight up 1965
yeah, it does.
kind
And
of,
you mentioned,
like Beatles there.
yeah, you mentioned Peace Frog, and while I was researching this too, I found out that originally the rest of the band recorded the music for the song before they had any lyrics for it, which was not the typical case for them. But
Okay.
they had wrote it and they jammed to it, and they're just like, oh, okay, Jim's not around. Let's just record it. So they recorded it, and then I guess Jim pulled out some of his older poems, and they went from there. And the music in that is fantastic.
Oh yeah, that's a Krieger tune for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, for sure. And that's a good album. And you mentioned The Spy when we started talking about this. I like that. That's a good tune.
I don't know. That one's always settled
Yeah.
in. I mean, I do my reference to the Morrison Hotel. I first heard it. I was in the UK. It's the first time I heard it
Mhm.
when I was 15, and I mean, I heard all the Doors albums that same year, but I didn't hear that one until I was in the UK, uh, and so I associate Morrison Hotel with being in Britain, which is weird, you know.
Yeah, but that's got to be a kind of a nice memory for you.
Yeah, it's cool.
Assuming your time there was good.
Oh no, it was great. It was wonderful. I mean, it was incredible, you know. But I think that was the only album I hadn't really heard yet, and a friend of mine had it on cassette, and I listened to it on my Walkman. You know, I mean, the whole
Now, what are your thoughts on? Well,
to
let's
date
go.
myself.
What are your thoughts on the final studio album with Jim, "L.A. Woman," which came out in April '71?
Well, you asked me what my favorite Doors album was,
Aha.
and so I don't have one,
Hmm.
and I don't even have two. I have three.
Okay.
They have six, but I have three favorite Doors albums. The Doors, the
Hmm.
first one. Strange Days, the
Nice.
second one, and L.A. Woman, the
"L.A.
last one.
Woman." There we go.
L.A. Woman is just so perfect. For me, and now I have reference points with my the night that I opened for Ray Manzarek that make it even more dear to me, you know,
Oh,
because
that's
like
wonderful.
yeah, I mean that album, it's like they're yes, they're tapping into their blues roots, and yeah, they're tapping into like the dark side, but it's also just like it's so foreboding because you know what happens.
Yeah.
Almost like they knew that it was the end.
Yeah. It's like
And
Riders on the Storm. It's like, did they know to put that as their last, song
yeah.
on the studio album? It's
And then just like the Changeling getting out of
yeah.
town, Lover Madly, right? Is
Hmm.
just like, I mean, it's just, but the whole album drives.
It
It just
does.
drives. It's like, it's, it is a highway album. It is a
Yeah.
moving album. It is a like road trip album. It's a like, and like, I mean, Texas Radio and the Big Beat, it's just like
Yes.
just solid, and I mean, what's it? Hyacinth House is a
Hyacinth
little
House, right?
lower, but it's very LA, of course. It's LA
Yeah.
one, right?
Right
But
before that, you got L'America, which is
oh
kind of
yeah,
very
I mean the
unique
bass
and different.
line,
Yeah.
but the other tune that's really long on the album, the two long songs are Riders in the Storm and LA Woman.
LA
And LA
Woman. Yeah.
Woman is, I mean, they're almost equal in terms of how great they are. And
Yeah.
the Mojo Rising element, the fact that
Hmm.
Morrison, that's an anagram of his own name,
Yes.
you know,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
he does the whole breakdown in the center, which is very kind of blues like, which is
Mhm.
very house blues, but also just very blues. But it's also just like, and then what do? They bring it back up, and you're back on the highway, you're back on the freeway. It's just like I remember hearing that song driving to a I had won this classical piano uh statewide thing. And so I'm like, it was at the moment when I was pretty high up in classical piano, but also in rock bands. And I was driving down with my mom and to a rehearsal because I was doing a big concert performance, and I was listening to classical piano. I didn't care. I was just doing it.
Right.
But listening to LA Woman as we rolled into Minneapolis. And to me, it was like I was rolling right into the center of Los Angeles, in
Oh,
my
nice. Oh,
teenage
that's
mind,
wonderful.
Yeah, it was just like I can hear that bass line, and that pounding forwardness of that song.
It's just such a, like you said, powerful is the right word for this song. It's just amazing. It's one
Yeah.
of their best, and phew, it's I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, it's just so iconic and such a fantastic song. And like you mentioned, the length of that song. I assume there was a single version that was shorter. I think for
Probably.
yeah,
Probably
yeah.
without the Mojo Rising part, maybe.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, if for anyone who only knows like the 4-minute version of the song, listen to the one on the album.
Oh,
It's
yeah. The
just
breakdown. I mean,
mhm,
the Densmore drums are, the way they break it down. It's
yes,
just like, it's a very 70s album too.
yeah,
It's like very like you could tell the darkness of the 70s is kind of coming in, right? It's like Nixon era is like very fevered. Vietnam is still on, like
Yeah.
kind of like heroin in the air. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
dark album. It's a gothic album, but it's also a very bluesy album at the same time, you know?
Yeah, sort of like the preceding album had been. You know, there was a lot of blues in it, and this one definitely had the blues and rock. And like you said, it's yeah, like you said, it came out in 1971, and what a way to dive into the 70s. It
Oh
was
yeah.
just an amazing album, and it's sadly the last one that they did with Morris. And I don't know if there's any other songs we didn't mention here that
Well, I mean, so
there's just so
I
many good
wanted
ones.
to bring up
Yeah.
one of my favorite rock and roll moments of all time, and if not my favorite, and that was, I mean, we're talking about Ray and the Doors and everybody, you know. So when the night that I opened for Ray, he had done his whole show. You know, they're done. They've done one encore, and they brought him out for a second encore, right?
Hmm.
And the band comes out, and Ray sits, you know, and the place is packed, right? And everybody's
Oh,
like, you
sure.
know, it's the end, right? And Ray's sits down, and it's like I'm kind of getting shivers as I think about it. Like he sits down, and like the room grew quiet, and he said into the he didn't even look at the audience. He kind of looked into the microphone, and he said, "This one's for Jim."
Oh, wow. Wow.
And then he started the line running down the keyboard from the top for Riders on the Storm.
Wow. Wow.
And
Yeah, that gives I bet that did give you chills. I mean, that's
they
just something.
encored with like a 20-minute version of Riders on the Storm
Wow.
with him singing.
That must have been incredible.
And I swear to you, in that moment, Jim Morrison was in the room and he was inside Ray singing that song. And I
Wow.
swear he was floating around up there. I mean, I literally, I looked up. Like
Wow.
I like,
What an amazing moment.
I will never, I stood there and I was like, it was like, it was truly rock and roll magic. Like I was like, I was where he is right now. And he is singing this song for his friend Jim, who's no
Wow.
longer here, and he's incanting Jim.
That's amazing.
And the whole audience was just like, I mean, it was really like no one needed drugs. I mean, it was just like, you know, and they didn't bring in, you know, any thunder and lightning like the beginning or the end of the song.
Right.
It didn't need it. It was just,
Doesn't sound like it.
it was palpable, man. It was, I will absolutely never forget that rock and roll moment for the like ever, you know,
Wow.
because I also
Because
knew I was like, you just were in the same spot on the stage doing what he's doing, you know?
yeah, I mean that's
And now
wow.
this is like, yeah. And it was just like, but there was also something, it was mystical. It was like Ray was, I mean, when he said this one's for Jim, like everybody was just like, I mean, everybody knew, you know, like,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
And it, you know, it was,
I wish I had been there for that. That just
I
sounds
can't even
seriously
explain.
the way you're describing it. I mean, I've had a few concert experiences that have been, you know, powerful, but that just sounds out of this world.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe it was a little more out of this world for me because I had just been on
Oh,
stage and I
sure. Yeah.
amped, you know, probably.
Yeah.
And, you know, but like, and to have them do that song and the band was incredible. I mean, his band was incredible. And the guys were so excellent. And it was like, I just, I don't even know I don't think I've ever been able to completely put into words what that felt like,
Wow.
you know? And then, you know, so that song rose to a whole nother, it's Riders on the Storm. I mean,
Yeah. Exactly.
everybody hears Riders on the Storm and they're immediately taken to a place. I mean, it's like it created the whole format for like a whole genre. I think even a film, you know, like
Yeah.
The Hitcher. hitchhiking and there's kind of a murderous element to it. And there's, this lost
Right.
ghost thing. And, there's this kind of like, it kind of reminds me of Ghost Riders in the Sky, the Johnny Cash
Oh
song.
yeah. Yeah. Great
And,
song.
but I just like, so you take all that and then that moment and I just go, and then when I learned that Ray passed away just a year and a half after that night, it just took that song and put it like
On a whole.
into a level that doesn't even feel like a song anymore, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And to me, I mean, that song, like you said, everybody knows that song. And I think I would venture to guess most music lovers really love that song. It's just so very unique. It's so damn good. And what I think is amazing is, the first album, the first song on there was Break On Through. It was a great first song to introduce the world to the Doors.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I would have loved the Doors to have gone on and on, but to make it a last song with Morrison actually turn out to be Riders on the Storm, I don't know. I don't know if fitting's the right word, but to me it fits.
Yeah, it's like that's the last song on the last album, and then Morrison dies.
Yeah.
Within what, like
It was pretty soon
within
afterwards.
the it's within the I
I
mean it
think
was
like
61, so
yeah. When did he died in July? Is that right? Is that what you
July 3rd.
Yeah, and this album came out April 19th. So it was wow.
Months.
Yeah.
And for me, like, so you got Morrison ends after LA Woman, and then for me, Ray moves on from this planet after he does Riders on the Storm. So it's just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
That's wild.
again, it's mystical,
It
it's
is
mystical and
mystical.
magical. And that's, people talk about like music as religion and different things like that. But I mean, and I can be very jaded about music, like any musician can.
Sure.
But that's an intangible,
Hmm.
you know, and I think that song is kind of intangible in that way.
Yeah. And well, it's hard to follow up that Riders on the Storm story there, especially with what I'm going to go into now. It's the fact that I'm going to mention that after that album, the Doors did release two more studio albums without Jim, and I'm not familiar with them. I think I heard like little tidbits of them before, but they released Other Voices in 1971, and the
Yeah.
album actually did fairly well. I was surprised to learn it went up to 31 on the charts.
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
Really? Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and there was a charting single from it too called "Tightrope Ride" that made it up to 71. And I don't know the song, so I'm actually kind of curious to check it out. And then that sold well enough that they did another album called "Full Circle" in 1972. I have not heard any of that I don't think, but I guess they decided to stop being the Doors at that point, and they reconvened in the late 70s actually to record music for under you mentioned this to me earlier, Jim Morrison's Poetry, an album that came out called An American Prayer that I am not personally familiar with. I've read some of Jim's poems, especially back when I was in high school, but I've never heard An American Prayer.
Well, I like you am very, I mean, sadly ignorant of the two albums without
I don't
Morrison.
want to check them out.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a tune, maybe I think like on a compilation album of Doors
Hmm.
stuff. That was like one, but I don't know them. But I do know American Prayer really well.
And
Uh I think I was going through a heavy poetry phase myself, so I think I was
okay.
a very, very pretentious 18-year-old poet, living in the Northwest. And it was, that's what I associate it with, but it's very well done because obviously they did it 6 or 7 years after Morrison had passed. And so
Hmm.
you have this poetry, and then they set it to music. And that was influential for me because I've done that. I mean,
Hmm.
I've done that since, right? And I've done lots of poetry, musical things. And there is a difference between poetry and music and writing songs. I mean, there's a different way to approach that.
Sure.
I mean, there are lots of examples, Jim Carroll Band,
Hmm.
and Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson, who was Lou Reed's wife. I mean, there's a lot of people that do poetry and then kind of combine music, but that album is I think it's a really good example of setting music to poetry as opposed to the opposite, right? And that's kind of what that Translucent Blues album was too, that Manzarek and Rogers did.
Oh, okay.
They were doing music based on the poetry of people like Michael McClure and, I don't think it was Bernie Taupin, but like really famous rock and roll lyricists,
Oh, how about that? Wow.
And so I would say it's a good album and it's also that album has one element that's kind of cool. Top of side two,
Mm-hmm.
people that actually care about side one versus side two. Top of side two is a very cool live version of Roadhouse Blues
Really? Oh, wow.
with a pretty long middle section.
Oh, nice.
And it's got the classic beginning. You can edit this out depending on what your what the classic beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I don't say at the particular word if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, Morrison has a very particular beginning where he says, "I'm going to get my kicks before this whole uh,
Yeah,
goes up
effing
in
something, I would think. Yeah.
There's no F in there.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yes, I'm going to get my kicks before this whole shit house goes
Oh,
up.
okay, gotcha.
But it's very Morrison, and it's a classic. And then they kick into Roadhouse Blues, and
Oh,
it's very,
nice. Oh, I
yeah.
want to check this
It
out
might
now.
be I can't remember if it's the beginning or the end of the song now, but
Okay.
it's just this really cool moment. It's almost worth having the album just for that song.
Yeah, I just saw the digital copy of that on Apple Music earlier today. I'm like, "Ooh, they have that. I got to give that a listen."
I mean, it's not everybody's thing, right?
Yeah, I'm
I
curious though.
I love poetry even to this day. So like and some people argue that Morrison wasn't a great poet. I disagree. I think Morrison was an incredible poet. I mean, I think that poetry is probably one of the most subjective
Oh,
things out
sure.
there. And we're both writers,
Yeah,
so um, but I encourage, that
I will
one.
check it out. I've just recently uh, developed a new interest in poetry, so I'm very curious about it. So I will check it.
I think you'll dig it. And especially hearing what the rest of the Doors did with the poetry, I thought it was very unique,
That's
I mean,
awesome.
it's 78, so I mean,
Yeah,
still, it's still, yeah, you'll hear it and you'll hear the way they
I will
did.
definitely check it out over the next couple days. And Gentry, this was a lot of fun, man. I'm looking at
Oh
the
man,
I'm looking
awesome.
at the
Love
time
it.
here. I'm like, shows don't usually run this long, but I just really, really enjoyed talking about the Doors with you. This was a blast.
Well, I'm kind of glad I didn't take notes because I would have been like, ready to talk about, I was already like listening to Morrison Hotel today. I was like, oh, that song. Oh, and
Yeah.
there's other songs that I could easily, bring up that I mean, just from the first album alone, we probably could have
Oh
done
yeah.
an hour on the first album.
Yeah, I know. And you know what you've really got me curious, and we had mentioned this going back and forth in emails, is the replacements. I cannot name one song by them.
Oh,
Somehow, I don't know how I missed out on them, but I am friends with so many musicians, so many other music fans, and people just love them. And I really need to dive into them, and maybe I'd have you back on the show and we could talk about the replacements.
I would be happy. I know that you brought up the replacements when Kevin Alexander was on talking about the Goo Goo Dolls,
Yes, right.
which is a great show that you
Well, thank
guys
you.
did. And I mean, it'd be fun to even talk with Kevin, if you wanted to do like a
Oh,
double guest, because I know he
he's
lives
pretty
in
into
the
them.
West, which is where. So I mean, I don't want to get off track from the Doors, but I got to see the Replacements before they broke up. I got to see them when I was 15, the same year that I discovered the Doors. It was my second concert ever. I had a broken leg
Oh man,
from my crotch to my toes.
ouch.
I had a heavy cast, and I refused to sit down for that entire show. I stood with
Oh man.
most of the other people there were college age. And I got to see, the Replacements broke up right after that. and if you get into the Replacements, you'll learn of their lore, and they have a lot of lore, just like the Doors and the mythology of it, because Bobby Stinson passed, he died, and that kind
Oh,
of ended
okay.
the first incarnation. But the music that you guys talked about in that show, you and Kevin, with the Goo Goo Dolls, and I love the Goo Goo Dolls. But yeah, they the Goo Goo Dolls admit, yeah, our stuff came from that era of Paul Westerberg and Bob Mould and Husker Du and Grant Hart and Tommy Stinson and
Wow.
all of it, and Soul Asylum and Dave Pirner, and it's a completely different side of music to the Doors, right?
Right.
Guys are like three chords in the truth punk rock, but some of the greatest songs ever written. And I have had the fortune of covering the Doors and also covering the Replacements. So I actually covered the Replacements more than I did the Doors, because the Doors are pretty hard to pull off,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
unless you're with um but yeah, I encourage that, man. I mean,
Okay.
Bad
Well,
Mouth,
I'm gonna do some listening, and I'll be in touch.
Skyway, I mean, endless, the Let It Be album. But there would be arguably no Replacements without the Doors. Uh, although, they did have a bass player.
I think a lot of music would have turned out differently without the Doors. They were just so amazing in so many ways, and so many singers wanted to be Jim Morrison, so many songwriters wanted to be him, and the
Still to
same
this
same with
day.
every other member of the band. You know?
Oh yeah. Still to this day.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I know the just last thing I'll say is I didn't get a chance to see them, but I know at one point the Doors partly got back together for some tours, I guess, in the 90s and the early part of the 21st century. Was it the Doors? They had to call themselves the Doors of the 21st century, I believe.
With Ian Astorbury from the Cult.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah.
actually, one of my best friends had gone to see them and said that they were amazing just to see Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek. I know Densmore wasn't part of that, but like you said early on too, it's nice to see like musicians still at the older ages still going out there and doing it. Not because people there's an audience for that still.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
And Ian Asbury is what a great person to do Morrison. They brought in a few different people to do kind of
oh yeah,
Morrison.
that's right. They did,
Eddie
didn't they?
Vedder, I know they brought in at one point, and Scott Weiland, and
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
there are different, people that. In fact, I saw an interview on David Letterman where Ray Manzarek was on with David Letterman, and so it's early '80s, right? Because
Right.
Letterman had been around, and they asked him, "So did you think about continuing the Doors after Morrison died?" And they said, "Yeah," or he said, "Yeah, we did. We thought about different people that we could have, and one of the people that they thought about having was Iggy Pop,
Really?
but the
Oh
band."
wow.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
and
that would have been interesting.
wild, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
He mentioned a couple of other people whose names I can't remember. Uh, but he brought up Iggy Pop, and Ray said to Dave, "Yeah, like I know, Ray, like I know Dave Letterman." Ray said to Dave, uh, he said, "Yeah, because Iggy was just on your show, right?" So it was like that early era of David Letterman, when like
Right.
Raymond Derek would be on one week, and Iggy Pop had just been on,
Oh,
and
I love that
like,
era of Dave's show.
yeah. So I mean, there were. I wish I could think of the other people that they had thought
Wow.
of, and they were really kind of weird
Hmm.
choices. But Iggy
That's
Pop, I thought,
interesting.
ooh, that would have been an interesting.
That really would have been interesting, and well, yeah, and like I said, I'm curious to hear those two albums now too, because
Yeah,
especially after us talking about the musicianship of each member of the Doors, and knowing that Robbie had gotten much more into songwriting on their last few albums, and Ray is just an incredible musician, and yeah, I'm gonna check those out, and now I got to check out the Replacements. You got me psyched up to listen to them.
yeah. I mean, I got to, you got to do it. But I do want to say, I think it's important to say that both John Densmore and Robbie Krieger are still alive and still
Yeah,
making music and still playing.
yeah.
You know,
I
for
know.
those who are listening or watching this, like, you can go see those guys. Like, go see them.
Yeah. Are they working together now
I
at
think they
all?
have
Yeah.
they do work together like sometimes, but I don't think that they're like, actively. I think
Right.
that they do, they got like a Krieger thing and a Densmore thing. And there, at one point I heard a Densmore album and it was like a pretty straight up jazz album that he had done.
Oh, wow. How about that?
It was after Ray had passed away. So they're making new stuff.
I think that's fantastic. And I know Densmore had put out his own autobiography at one point, giving his side of the Doors story. I would like to read that. I'd be really
Yeah.
curious to hear
Heard that.
that.
I think that
So,
might be what Oliver Stone used when he did his Doors movie.
okay, interesting. Well, now I'm especially intrigued. And
Yeah.
my friend, this was a blast. And for
Awesome.
those
Loved it
listening or
so much.
watching, I hope you enjoyed it. And one last thing, though, before I let you go, Mr. Bronson,
Yeah.
is where can folks find you online? I just want to
It's
know.
it's pretty easy to find me because my name is Gentry Bronson.
So
um
go to kipbronson.com.
yeah, go to Kip Bronson and you'll find
The best chickens you've ever
Buddy's
seen
new
before in your life.
novel. Um
GentryBronson.com.
yeah, gentrybronson.com is a really easy place. You can find writing of mine there. You can find albums of mine there. Uh, you can also just put my name in Google and a lot of stuff comes up. But if you want to see what I actively create now, is the reason that we're doing this show. You found me through that. Is I'm a writer in addition to being a creative and media consultant. I mean, I actively write and publish for a number of things, and I mean, I just published something a few days ago, and that's on Medium under my name, but you can also find me on like Substack and Your Tango and my website. And
And you're on X, I know, right?
I'm
Yeah.
on X, I'm on Instagram, I have a YouTube channel I haven't used in a long time. I mean, I'm out there.
That's
I'm on
awesome.
Threads.
It's hard to keep up with all the social media things that we
Yeah, I
have to
mean,
be on the show.
I mean, it's just like, you can just go to gentrybronson.com
Yeah,
and
there
it
you go.
goes out because then you can find like Apple Music and Amazon Music and Spotify and blah 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 blah, all the medias in the universe. Uh, or you can put in Kip Gentry, whom I was named after, and you can find what might be the traces of who I was named after, because that's a whole nother story. I was contacted by a really wonderful guy late last year who said that I might have been named after his father.
Oh,
He
wow.
might be the hitchhiker that my parents picked up
Get out of here.
in the blizzard between Wyoming and Nebraska. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty wild.
A whole nother story. I'm going to leave it at that. But he and I are
Okay.
in touch.
And yeah,
So,
check out Gentry's music too. I mentioned earlier liking some of your stuff. And Tranquillo, is that your first album?
oh, Tranquillo.
I
Well,
apologize. Yeah.
actually, my first solo album, I guess technically was that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Uh,
I remember listening to
I
that on Spotify. And
The Night Watchman was my band from 2001 to 2005, and I that solo album came out in 2004, but I had two solo albums in 2004, and then I had a Night Watchman album in 2005, and then I went completely solo in 2006.
wow, that's so awesome.
That's how 7 albums add up in, years pretty fast. But
I
yeah,
think that's really
Frontier is
impressive.
one of my instrumental piano albums. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had it on this morning when I was driving my wife to work, and she's like, "Wow, what is this?" I'm like, "This guy's going to be on my show today, honey."
Oh, well, that's nice. Yeah, I have
So I think you might have earned me some cool points there. So I appreciate that.
if you are interested in this side of things, I have I'm a big meditation practitioner, and I'm really I'm a practicing not Orthodox Buddhist, which I know Ray Manzarek was at one point for a little
Oh,
while.
okay. I
And
enjoy meditating.
meditator, but I have a lot of music on the meditation app Insight Timer. So I have a lot of meditation music out there, and
Oh, okay.
so all my instrumental music is kind of that side of things, and then I have my whole like barefoot piano punk side that I was.
Oh, nice. Well, it looks like there's a lot of stuff for everyone to check out there. So please do that. And
Yeah.
I'm really curious about that too, because I enjoy meditating. I meditate sometimes without music, sometimes with instruction, but I really like listening to music while I meditate, like we do. Are you familiar with Liquid Mind? We listen to
Yeah.
Liquid. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I listen to that pretty regularly. So I'm going to definitely check out more of your stuff.
Yeah. I got a couple, three instrumental albums, and then a whole lot of other albums with lyrical, crazy blowout rock and roll, barefoot, whatever.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. Well, between that and the replacements, man, I'm going to be busy. I don't know if I'm gonna have room for that new Taylor Swift album that's coming out this week.
Oh
I don't know,
man.
man.
Get it all in, man. Get it
I,
in.
all right, my friend. Well, thank you again for
Thank you, buddy.
being here, and I thank everybody for taking part in our show. No matter what you're doing today, folks, have yourself a great time. See ya.
All right.